Chris wakes up by David Wright and Sean Platt. Chris woke to an explosion in the distance, slightly worse than the eruption between his ears. He tried to open his eyes, but the lids were heavy, sticky, and refusing to open to the bright light on the other side. And then he remembered. His eyes shot open. There she was beside him, motionless, the top half of her head gone in a bucket of blood, plastering the wall behind her. Alison. He looked down at the gun, shaking in his hand, then threw it to the end of the bed, disgusted. An ice-cold blade of sorrow cut into his heart, and he closed his eyes, sobbing. He shouldn't be here. He should be with her. Yet, here he was, still alive. He reached up, felt his head, sticky with blood. He stood, groggy, a screaming, hollow pain shooting through his entire body. There was another feeling there too, something like fire flooding his veins and baking his skin. His head felt as if it were stuck in a vice which someone was turning from all sides and digging into his temples with barbed metal pins. He stumbled toward the bathroom and stared at his ghastly reflection. The gunshot had taken out the top left chunk of his head, in through the temple, then out the top. The wound was open gore, skin raw. It was bloody, but not bleeding, and seemed, oddly enough, to be in the beginning stages of healing. He returned to the bed and knelt beside Alison, trying to unsee the truth of the horror before him, trying to imagine her as she'd been, before she got the sickness, before the gunshot wound. Seeing her there, lifeless, the bottom half of her body still beautiful in blue sweats and a grey long-sleeved t-shirt, somehow made the reality more impossible to accept. Chris reached out and touched her hand. It was cold and stiff. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered her name, or at least tried to push the 3 perfect syllables through his tortured moans. He spoke again, but what he was saying in his head was nothing like the sound he was actually making, as though his mouth had lost his mind's transmission, delivering broken garbles rather than words. The gunshot. I must have hit something affecting my speech. Or... He didn't want to consider the alternative. He couldn't consider the alternative. He scrambled back to the bathroom, found his reflection, and leaned into the mirror, scrutinizing every detail, looking for signs. There was something different in his eyes. They were still blue but clouded, pupils dilated large and black, which explained the impossibly bright light. His skin was pale, but that was no different than normal. But there was something else, a slight change of colour to his flesh, almost grey. And then he saw the circular dark splotches on his neck. No, no, no. He looked down at the framed photo on the counter between the his and her sinks. The frame was wood, with ornate vines twisting and turning around the photo of their hands clasped together, holding a stick and drawing a heart in the wet beach sand. He flashed back to last night, his last moments with her. "I'm sick," she said earlier in the day. He'd suspected it, but didn't want to ask, didn't want to know. She showed him the 2 small rings on her neck, one of the surest signs of infection, the one the doctors had been talking about mostly, the one that the soldiers looked for before deciding whether to shoot you on the spot. The other sign was a change in skin colour to an almost greyish hue. But skin colour was hard to judge when they'd spent a majority of their time indoors, hiding out. He stared at the rings on her neck. There was no sugarcoating this. She was infected. Surely he was next. Unless he was one of the estimated 5% who were somehow immune. Now, they waited. They would either die or become one of the creatures roaming the streets, feasting on anything they found, animal or human. "I'm so sorry," she said, backing away and into the bathroom. "Lock the door. Protect yourself." "No," Chris said. "It's too late. If I'm going to catch it, I've already caught it. You're infectious 2 days before the symptoms, remember?" "I'm so sorry," she said again, crying as she fell against him. "I shouldn't have opened the door." They spent the rest of the day talking about all the things they'd talked about 100 times before, but Chris didn't mind. His wife's childhood stories warmed his heart. His own childhood had been pretty shitty, so Chris found her family stories of how she fought over stupid stuff with her sisters and got caught lying about her grades amusing and sweet. He had often wondered what it would have been like to have a big family like you saw on TV and in the movies. He hoped to someday make a large family once she got off the pill and was ready to raise children. Of course, talking about Alison's family made her wonder again if they were alive. The phone's lines were down for good. Cell towers too. She'd gotten a text a week ago from her older sister, Meg, who said their mother had gotten sick, and Meg suspected she might be too. That was the last they'd heard. 3 days ago, Alison decided she had to find her sister to see if she was okay. Chris said no, it was too dangerous. The military was shooting people on the streets. Citizens were supposed to stay inside until order was restored. Once a week, every Monday at 5 p.m, a truck brought supplies to a nearby park. Food, bottled water, and sometimes blankets. When the curfews began, he had to wait in a line of more than 200 people for his allotment. Last week, there were less than 15 people in line. He wondered how much longer the trucks would come when the number of people grew too few to make the trips worthwhile. If you were caught outside at any time other than Monday during the hours of 4 p.m. to 8 p.m, the roving military units that swept the streets for creatures and survivors under attack were allowed to shoot on sight. The curfews had kept all but the brave and foolhardy indoors. Despite the threats, Alison decided Friday that she had to attempt to see her family before her mum was gone. She grabbed the keys to the car and asked Chris to come with her. "We can't go," Chris pleaded, afraid for her more than himself. He couldn't even imagine any harm coming to her, let alone watch her succumb to the sickness. "I'll go myself," she said, running outside and starting the car. He followed, reaching into the car and grabbing the keys, then ran back into the house. She chased him. Once inside, Chris slammed the door shut and locked it. "Why are you risking going there?" he asked, pissed. "What are you going to do? Are you some kind of doctor who can cure her or something? If they're sick, there's nothing you can do. If they're fine, you'll see them when this is all over." "I can't let them die alone," she cried. "They're my family." "And if you go there, you'll get infected and you'll die," he said. "I can't live without you, Alison." "Give me the keys," she yelled. "No," he said, putting them in his back pocket. She ran at him, infuriated, pounding her fists into his chest like a crazy person. "Damn it, give me the keys!" "No," he said, grabbing her, holding her tight even as she screamed and battered his chest. Finally, Alison surrendered to tears, and they fell to the ground crying together. That was 3 days ago. "Please kill me," she said last night, as they lay in bed together. "I don't want to suffer. I don't want to become one of those things." "There's got to be a way," he said. "Maybe you've got something else. Look at me. I'm not sick yet." "I can feel it," she said. "It's in me. I'm dizzy, confused." Her health faded quickly. At 5 p.m, she seemed like her old self, more or less. By nightfall, she was a shell of the woman he knew. By 9 p.m, she was laying in bed, burning up, barely able to move, her whole body shaking. Her eyes had turned dark, and her voice had decayed to a slur. The worst part was how she kept talking, though none of the words made sense. Her face was like wounded cats, seeming confused by the world around her, and more alarmingly, by Chris. At times, she looked at him nervously, as if she didn't know who he was. He stopped telling her he couldn't understand, since it only seemed to upset her. Soon enough, he was nodding along to whatever she murmured as he wiped her forehead with a cool towel. At 10:31, she managed 2 words through the slurs. "Kill me." He got the gun from the nightstand, his hand shaking, barely able to turn the safety off. He looked her in the eyes, hollow sockets of confusion. But when she saw the gun, a smile crept to the corners of her mouth. He leaned down, closed his eyes, kissed her on the forehead, and whispered, "I love you." Then he pulled the trigger. He prayed over her dead body, tears streaming down his face. He prayed for forgiveness, prayed for her to go to heaven, then prayed God would allow him to join her. He was pretty certain God would see his act as mercy. Suicide was another story, though. He'd have to take his chances and beg for some mercy from whoever judged such things. He prayed to soon be at Alison's side. Chris put the gun to his head and said, "Please forgive me." He pulled the trigger, and everything went black. Until he woke this morning. Chris shook his head, closed his eyes, then forced himself back into the bedroom. Outside, another explosion detonated in the distance. How far? Sounded like the gas station near the highway. He stopped, pausing to recall the name of the station, but couldn't. He shook his head, annoyed. Why can't I remember? I go there 3 times a week. He could distinctly remember putting gas in his car, looking into the store. The window had a clear view into the small sandwich shop inside the station. He'd often wondered if he'd ever be hungry enough to buy a sandwich from a gas station. He hoped not. He remembered a sign above the door with the shop's name. Yet all he could remember was a vague blue circle, or maybe a square. His thoughts were jumbled by the sound of a million bees buzzing in his head, distracting him. The sound was low, maybe a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10, but it was loud enough to scramble his thoughts and make concentration nearly impossible. Chris shook his head and pressed on his ears, but nothing silenced the sound. He groaned, frustrated, and started clawing at his arm, shocked when a chunk of flesh fell into his hand and some of it onto the floor. Blood flowed from the gaping wound in his forearm, yet he couldn't feel the pain, couldn't feel anything other than the headache pounding between his temples. He stared at his handful of meat, and his stomach twisted. He threw the chunk of flesh to the ground and went back into the bathroom and tore open the medicine chest, knocking bottles and boxes into the sink, desperate to find something to stop the bleeding. What am I looking for? He stared into the sink, trying to make sense of the scattered objects. Familiar, but meaningless. The buzzing continued. Something clicked in his head. The blue box. He opened it, found an adhesive dressing, then remembered what it was and what to do with it. He removed the backing, pressed the dressing against his skin, and sat on the bathroom floor, lost in thought, and happy he'd been able to dress the wound. He sat with a smile on his face for what seemed an eternity, before he was snapped from his thoughts by a sound outside his house. "Hello?" a man's voice called. Chris closed his eyes, trying to place the voice, familiar but faceless. Who the hell is out on the streets with everything that's going on out there? Either a soldier, a fool, or both. "Chris? Alison? You in there?" Chris stood, then stumbled towards his front door, finding it hard to get his body to do what he wanted, like suddenly trying to drive stick when you only knew automatic. He opened the door to a brown-haired man in his mid-30s. The man was smiling, at first. Then the man was staring at Chris, a nervous look on his face. "Jesus Christ, what happened?" Chris tried to remember the man who obviously knew him, but his mind was coming up blank for a name. The man came in, closed the door, and locked it. What happened? Chris tried to tell him, but nothing came out other than his horrible groans. The man's eyes doubled in size. "Oh my God," he said, backing up toward the door. "Why?" "You're infected." The bees buzzed louder in Chris's head, and something clicked inside him, an intense, immediate hunger that had to be sated now. But not sated by food. His mouth salivated at the thought of biting in the man's flesh. His stomach, round, large, looked as appealing to Chris as a juicy burger would have yesterday. Even though a part of him was surely disgusted by the notion of biting, much less eating a person, that part was drowned out by a hunger which seemed as natural as any other. The man realized he was in danger and fumbled with the doorknob, trying to open the door as Chris moved towards him. The man's hand managed to unlock the door, and he pushed through it, then fell forward outside, tripping once, twice, then popping back up and turning back frantically towards Chris before running across the street and into the neighbor's backyard. Chris looked up, saw smoke smothering much of the skyline. Something had exploded. Many things had, judging from the number of spirals greying the sky. gunshots that sounded like artillery you'd hear in the background of a war movie fired in the distance. There was a stench in the air, a sickly, sweet smell Chris recognized on a primal level. Death. Part of him was alarmed, compelled to run back inside the house and hold her hand. Maybe finish the job he'd set out to do and not miss his brain this time. Hold her hand. Hold. Shit. He couldn't remember her name. The buzzing continued, and he shook his head violently, annoyed. Suddenly, a scream came from across the street in the direction the man had run. The buzzing grew louder, its tone slightly changing. He ambled toward the house across the street, led more by instinct than curiosity. As he rounded the rear of the house, he saw the man standing in front of a doghouse, waving a shovel at 3 of the infected, who were in much worse condition than Chris. They looked like they'd shuffled right off the set of a zombie movie. "Stay away from her," the man screamed. Her? That's when Chris saw the huddled figure inside the doghouse, a young girl, maybe 8 years old. She looked familiar, but he couldn't remember her name. The 3 monsters were completely infected, skin mottled, bloody and rotting. Teeth were dark, stained in blood, eyes red. They moved slowly, as if confused or drunk, but seemed no less dangerous. One of them caught hold of the shovel, managing to keep hold, as another one of the creatures leaped onto the man, sinking his teeth into the man's neck. Blood gushed from the man's wound as the creature pulled its head back, tearing ragged strips of the man's flesh. Chris stared, repulsed, and hungry. The girl in the doghouse screamed, drawing the zombies' attention. 2 of the zombies broke away from the newly dead man as the third stayed on top, biting and swallowing chunks of the man's face. They cornered the girl. She scurried back, screaming. Chris stared, helplessly. The bees were now agitated, deafening in his head, growing angrier by the second, as if in response to what was happening. He had to save the girl. He screamed, though it was more of a shriek, and all 3 of the zombies turned to look at him. Fuck, he thought, realizing he had no weapon. But they didn't approach him. The one monster continued to feast on intestines as the other 2 bent down, clawing into the doghouse. Chris stumbled toward the doghouse, picked up the shovel the dead man had dropped, and swung it into the skull of one of the 2 monsters. Its head imploded like a rotten pumpkin, blood and brains spilling from its broken shell as its body collapsed. The second monster turned, and Chris swung again, killing it in 2 blows. The third zombie continued feasting on the dead man, pulling at his intestines like overcooked spaghetti, one eye on Chris the whole time, like a mad dog glaring at those who threatened its food. "Stay away. My meal." Chris bent down and looked into the doghouse. The girl cried out. He wanted to tell her to come out. It would be okay. He would help her. But he knew his mouth wouldn't work. And to her, he probably seemed no different than the creatures who were trying to eat her. As he got closer to the entrance of the doghouse, she stopped screaming, as though she recognized him. The girl scrambled from the doghouse, running right to him, and wrapping her arms around his waist, crying. The buzzing in his head again grew louder as he tried to remember the girl. He'd seen her before, but couldn't remember where. She obviously knew him, and was looking to him for salvation. He picked her up, drawing attention from the last of the monsters, who looked up from its meal, as if considering a snack. Chris growled at the monster, and bared his teeth, a primal, "Don't you fucking dare." Chris brought the girl inside his house and laid her on the sofa. "What's wrong with your head?" she asked as Chris bolted the door, checking the window to make sure no one had followed them. He saw 3 more creatures a few houses over, shuffling about, not seeming to have taken notice of them. He turned back to the girl, who was sitting, staring at him, clutching one of the pillows. He tried to answer her. His words came out as a groan, and the girl's eyes widened, but not with the same fear that the man had. Maybe the girl wasn't aware enough to know what he was becoming. She merely sensed that something was wrong. "Are you okay?" The buzzing in his head wasn't as loud, but it was as pervasive as it had been, and seemed to change frequencies often, making it even more difficult for Chris to organize his thoughts. The sound was like someone were turning a radio station dial in his head, except the static was replaced by buzzing, and they could never find a channel with anything resembling a clear signal. He felt like half his brain was focused on trying to interpret the buzzing, and was therefore unable to handle other functions, such as remembering how to speak or recognizing names or faces. As he tried to figure out how he could talk to the girl, an image managed to break through the confusion. The magnetic message board on the fridge. Chris went into the kitchen, removed the board from the fridge, then wiped the words, a shopping list, off with his shirt. He sat in the recliner across from the couch and wrote with the dry erase marker, "I'll be okay. My name is Chris. What's yours?" He set the board on the coffee table, which sat between his chair and the couch. He watched her read it. Judging from her reaction, his words were not nearly as clear to her as they were to him. Maybe his brain was so damaged he couldn't make proper words by mouth or hand. Or maybe she couldn't read, though she seemed old enough. She wiped the board on her pink and blue t-shirt and wrote back, "My name is Summer." Chris breathed a sigh of relief. She wrote again, "I'm 9. He stared at her, stomach growling. Images flooded his mind, biting her, tearing into her flesh, chewing. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine something, anything else, to make the images and the hunger go away. More thoughts swam through his mind. Reaching out, pulling her head back, biting her cheek, then into her soft stomach, tearing at her fatty flesh and swallowing it. He closed his eyes tighter, trying to cast the images out, only to have them sharpen. He opened his eyes and squeezed his injured arm, in a desperate attempt to create pain that would overrule his hunger and horrible thoughts. The surge of pain worked, and he was able to look at her again and keep the violent impulses under control. For the moment. Summer erased the board again, then wrote, "Are you sick?" "My parents got sick." He stared at her, not wanting to say yes, not wanting to scare her away. He tried to tell himself that he only wanted to keep her safe, to keep her in his house to protect her. And it was true, of part of him. Another part had calculated that the minute she left, he could no longer eat her, so this monster inside him would keep her around as long as possible until it won the battle brewing in his head. The bees were seething. Tell her, yes, you're sick. Scare her. Save her. He swallowed, shook his head no, he wasn't sick. He held out his hand, asking for the board. She wiped her words away and slid it across the table. He wrote, "Where are your parents?" He slid the board to her. The girl started to erase it, then laughed. Chris was confused. "I don't know why I'm writing," she said. "I can talk just fine." Chris laughed. At least it started as a laugh, but came out sick and congested. "My dad got sick and ran outside so he wouldn't infect us. He was shot by soldiers 2 days ago. My mum locked me in the cellar and told me she was sick too, and not to come out no matter what. She put a bunch of food and water in there, but in the middle of the night, someone came in and shot her. I heard voices asking if anyone else was in the house, but I was too scared to say anything. I came out this morning and was looking for anyone I knew." He held out his hand, and she slid the board to him. "Do you know me?" He held the board up. "We lived, 4 houses down, but no, I don't know you or... Is your wife here?" Chris's mind flashed on the body upstairs, trying to remember her name, which had been deleted from his brain and replaced by incessant buzzing. He shook his head, and the girl seemed to understand. How can I not remember her name? To not die beside her was a cruel enough fate, but to surrender her memory to whatever disease that was ravaging him, that was beyond cruel. "Does it hurt?" the girl asked, pointing to his head. He nodded. "Can I help?" she asked, standing up and walking towards him. As she drew closer, his hunger stirred and his hands started to tremble. He put one on top of the other, trying to hold it down. He glared at her, shook his head, and tried to say, "No!" Summer jumped back, startled, eyes wide. "You are sick, aren't you?" He stared at her, his inner buzz near deafening. He wanted to shake his head no. Draw her closer. His eyes were glued to the part of her arm, just beneath the sleeve of her shirt. He wanted to grab it, sink his teeth in, snap her neck, bite her throat, drink her blood. Then he'd tear open her soft stomach, shove his hands into her, and feast as the monster had done on the man across the street. Chris's body began to shake as the buzzing grew louder and his humanity struggled to maintain control. "Are you sick?" she asked again, eyes wide, so innocent. "She will believe anything I say." That vulnerability made him cry inside. If she left his house, she would be doomed by the first infected to find her. But if she stayed here, he was the danger. Reluctantly, he nodded his head yes, tears streaming down his face. He grabbed the board, erased the words quickly, and scribbled, Goaway, hungry. The girl stared at the board, eyes tearing up. "Please, mister, don't make me leave. It's so scary out there. Do you have an attic? You could lock me in?" "Not safe," he wrote, turning away from her, unable to look at her without surrendering to the violent images. The swarm had multiplied, buzzing with different frequencies, all clamoring to be heard, to be understood. He shook his head, as if it would silence the sound or numb his hunger. "You're not one of the bad ones," the girl said. "I can tell." He slowly lifted his head, arms shaking violently now, and stared at her. Why won't she fucking leave? Suddenly, a window in the kitchen shattered. The girl screamed. Chris stood up and made his way to the kitchen, legs stiff and splintered in pain, every step an effort. One of the creatures had broken the sliding glass door and was pushing his way into the house, moaning loudly, crimson eyes looking past Chris and toward the living room, as if catching a whiff of the girl's fresh scent. The buzzing grew louder, as if it were no longer just in Chris's head, but also being broadcast from the open mouth of the monster in his kitchen. Chris screamed at the girl to run upstairs, but his warning came out as grunts, and the girl instead hid behind the couch. Chris grabbed a knife from the butcher block with both hands and rushed at the monster, shoving the blade deep into its face and up through the top of its skull. The zombie fell to the ground, dagger still in its skull. It wasn't alone. At least a dozen more were stumbling through his backyard, slowly making their way towards the breached kitchen door, all of their mouths open, broadcasting that horrible buzzing sound. Chris grabbed another knife, the last of the big ones in the butcher block, and realized there was no way he could kill them all. They would swarm him before he could bring down two. Shit. As the creatures drew closer, he noticed that while most were slow and ambling, others were fast, almost animal-like in their movement. The buzzing increased, in his head and from their mouths. It was only then that he realized the sound was also coming from his mouth. He closed his mouth, though it didn't silence the buzzing in his head. Chris turned to the living room, forcing himself to move faster. He dropped the blade on the carpet, grabbed the girl into his arms, and raced through splintering pain upstairs. As he reached the top step, he could hear creatures banging into the furniture downstairs. Won't be long now. They entered the bedroom, and the girl screamed, seeing Chris's wife in bed, blood painting the wall. He fumbled with the doorknob, freezing for a moment, struggling to remember how to lock it. The buzzing was now so loud in his head, it made thinking through the simplest act nearly impossible, like trying to figure out a trigonometry problem in a burning house. Finally, he was able to think his way through the buzzing enough to slide the lock closed, just as one of the creatures slammed into the door. The girl, whose name he could no longer remember, screamed. He turned, saw the gun on the bed, then picked it up, grabbed the girl, and pulled her into the closet, closing the door behind them. There was no lock on the closet door, and he wasn't sure how he'd hold them off. All he could do was hope that they wouldn't look in the closet. The girl was crying incoherently. He pulled her to his lap, wrapped an arm around her, and placed a palm over her mouth, trying to keep her quiet. The banging in the hallway grew louder, as the swarming sound in his head grew louder, still. More banging against the door. He didn't know how long the door would hold, but didn't think it would be much longer. Once the girl's cries turned to whimpers, he removed his hand. Her back against his chest, her scent stirred his hunger. Though the closet was dark, it wasn't pitch black, and he could see the outline of her neck where it met her shoulder, before vanishing beneath her shirt collar. He leaned forward, sniffing the sweetness of her scent, closed his eyes, and opened his mouth, inching ever closer to her neck. The hunger twisted inside him, thoughts of ripping flesh fueling his thoughts. Flesh would make the buzzing go away, would sate him, would fill him. The buzzing in his brain swelled, rising to a tea kettle-like pitch as he moved his mouth closer, ready to bite. "Are we going to die?" the girl cried out, her voice so broken with terror it snapped him from his daze. The buzzing receded to a lower hum, and he shook his head as she turned to see his response. He held the gun out, in front of both of them, checking the chamber. 3 bullets. 1 for a monster, 1 for the girl, 1 for him. This time, he would not miss. The door burst open. He heard them flood into the room, groaning and buzzing as they bumped into things. A glass shattered, and the girl jumped. Chris quickly palmed her mouth before she could cry out. He prayed that the zombies' thoughts were as consumed by the buzzing as his own. Maybe they'd not even look in the closet. Maybe they'd keep moving. The sounds outside the closet seemed to be dying down a bit, and Chris hoped that some of them had moved on and the rest would follow. Maybe he and the girl would be safe. Then a bang against the closet. The girl screamed, and the closet door began to shake as 1, 2, or more of the fuckers clawed at it, desperate to get to them. He held the door in place with his feet, but as it began to slip, he realized he couldn't hold it forever. They would get in. It was only a matter of time or numbers. Chris brought the gun to the girl's head, closed his eyes, and held his finger on the trigger, waiting for the closet door to open. Suddenly, automatic gunfire erupted in the bedroom like thunder. Chris, startled, dropped the pistol, and it fired a deafening shot in the closet. Seconds later, the door burst open and light bleached their world. 2 soldiers with masks stood, automatic rifles aimed at him and the girl. Dead zombies lay in pools of blood behind them. "We've got survivors," one of the soldiers said into a radio. "Adult male, female child." The soldiers reached down to help the girl up. The hunger surged with the introduction of 2 new bodies. The buzzing began to rise and whistle again. He could eat them both and spare the girl. If she saw him eat them, she'd run away, be saved by whatever other soldiers were waiting outside. Chris began to stand. "Oh my God!" one of the soldiers said, staring down at Chris. "We've got an infected!" "No!" the girl screamed. "He's one of the good ones!" Too late. The soldiers opened fire, and Chris fell back into the closet, collapsing as bullets tore into his flesh. As his life faded, he could see and hear the girl wailing as a soldier pulled her from the room. He hoped she'd be okay, that he hadn't infected her, whatever her name was. The remaining soldier lifted Chris's body, dragged him to the bed where his wife's corpse lay, and dropped him on top of her. Chris stared at what was left of her face, her soft lips, her beautiful, now blood-soaked hair. Goodbye, Mai. His soul twisted in agony that he couldn't remember the name of his life's true love. The soldier stepped from the room. Another came in with a heavy-looking flamethrower. As the sound of fire erupted, the swarm's buzzing mercifully ceased. Silence, at last. Then his world exploded in a fiery blast. And he remembered. Allison.